The Tea Party and Occupy movements, both groups have dominated the political headlines, demanding a change in the way our country operates.
We are the free! We are the free! Our flag still wins!
Occupiers call themselves the 99%, saying they've had enough of Wall Street's corporate greed. The Tea Party claims lower taxation, smaller government, and less regulation is the way to prosperity.
We are the American people! We are the 99%! We are the 99%!
One group has set up camps across the country, sometimes being forcefully removed by police. The other has held political rallies on the steps of nearly every state capital, with some members even throwing their support behind candidates for president.
When I was younger, this is not what my future looked like.
Two parties with two philosophies on how to change the political landscape in America. Coming up in a Focus 15 event, a first-of-its-kind conversation between both the Occupy Wall Street and Tea Party movements.
Live from the Wild Ballroom on the beautiful IPFW campus, News Channel 15 and the News Sentinel come together to bring you this Focus 15 event, Occupy versus Tea Party. Here's your host, Mark Mellinger.
And welcome. It is great to have you with us for this Focus 15 special, Occupy versus Tea Party. This is both an on-air and online broadcast, so you are going to have a chance to give your thoughts and opinions. Some of you have done that already. We thank you for that. The rest of you, you'll have plenty of chances over the next hour or hour and a half for those of you who are following us online. So tonight it is just what we said, Occupy versus the Tea Party. The members are sitting up here with me. On the Occupy side, our team is Bob, Sarah, and Max. Welcome to all of you. On the Tea Party side, we have Rick, Lisa, and Emery. It should be a good discussion. We're looking forward to getting it going. We'll do that in just a moment. But first, we're also joined tonight by multimedia journalist Sarah Jansen from the News Sentinel. So Sarah, tell us what you're going to be up to.
Well, Mark, tonight I'm going to be standing by with my netbook here, and I'm going to be monitoring social media, Twitter, Facebook, and also my email account to see what everyone's talking about and taking questions and comments to give back to you.
Okay, and if you want to follow the conversation on Twitter, just keep in mind it's OccupyTPChat. That's the hashtag OccupyTPChat. Now, we agreed on 4 topics to cover in tonight's discussion. The first one has to do with TARP. Let me start it here. Whoever wants to jump in first, feel free to do it. Who thinks passing TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, was the right thing to do? Absolutely nobody. Nobody is jumping in. Nobody thinks TARP was the right thing to do. Okay, why not?
Not at all, man.
Well, and we already have applause.
Basically what we have here is we've got these banksters running around playing fast and loose with everybody else's money. They made some bad bets, they lost the money, and then they come back to us with their hands out, and we're supposed to feel sorry for them as if we're responsible for them.
What about the argument that the government was just doing what was necessary to prevent another depression?
I don't see why you need to bail out those particular firms. If you've got the funds together in the same place already, you can do the job of a bank. You can create a new bank. You don't need to prop up the old banks that have already been committing crimes, already been taking advantage of the poor, of people in this country, people who are just trying to live in houses and have mortgages. They're taking advantage of people, and we can create alternative institutions instead of injecting all of the taxpayers' money back into the old ones that have already done us wrong and proven that they can't regulate our economy for us.
All right, this is supposed to be a free-flowing discussion. Somebody from the Tea Party side, step up.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that you can't take the citizens' money, the taxpayers' money, and put it into failure. And you can't prop up companies that have failed with taxpayers' money. A firm should succeed or fail on its own. They should not be bailed out, with other people's money based on their failures, because that encourages more failure. And it also robs the people of the tax revenues that can be used and should be used for other causes that are legitimate constitutional causes for our taxation.
What about the argument, though, that this was such a potentially catastrophic event, that all these financial institutions that were bailed out touch so many other sectors of life, that the government was just doing what it needed to do, both the Bush and Obama administrations, to stave off perhaps another decade like the Great Depression?
Go ahead.
As we noticed, no one in the audience agreed with the idea of the bailout. It just proves that there's no bankers from Goldman Sachs here tonight. But as far as the belief that we had to have this bailout because if we didn't, it would flatten and pancake the entire economy, the reality is that we could have had a contagion on the bond crisis that would have occurred, and we could have preserved the integrity of the bond system, and yet at the same time taken those bad actors, whether it's Goldman Sachs, Morgan, all those different Wall Street brokerage houses that created and engineered this disaster, and we could have done what we should have done, which was take their entire book net and written it to zero. We should have put them through a structured bankruptcy like we did General Motors. There's no justification for allowing the people who caused the economic crisis to themselves have the greatest profitable year in 2009 that they had ever had. So not only did they blow up our economy, we bailed them out, and then in turn they take tremendous amounts of those billions of dollars and give it to themselves as bonuses.
This is the way Wall Street operates, some people would say. Bob, Sarah. By the way, what Sarah is doing there, for those of you who don't know, she's saying, I agree with you. That is, I mean, this is what the Occupy movement does. You have hand signals.
Exactly.
Right?
Disagree. So.
Okay, that's disagree. Okay. All right, I'm learning this as we go along.
And then you can tell us to stay on point if we wander and get off topic.
Okay. All right, thanks for educating me on that. Well, Bob, you chime in here. I know you feel pretty strongly about this.
Well, I mean, I think we all feel that our government has basically given in to a swindle. I mean, these financial actors have controlled our government for a long time. And, you know, TARP's nothing new, in my opinion. It's a continuation of an old practice. 1982, there was a savings and loan. Well, what led to the savings and loan crisis? I mean, Reagan passed the Garn-St. Germain Act, which basically eliminated deposit caps, so banks weren't required to hold as much capital. And when you have those types of pullbacks in what was once sound regulation, then you kind of lead the market to crisis. The market floods in and acts accordingly. So I think TARP is a continuation of a bad practice.
Would you guys agree with that? Emery?
I would add even more to that and say that we were led through fear-mongering as the need for TARP. We were told that if it didn't happen, it would be a big crash.
Well, what do you think would have happened without it?
Well, the same thing that did happen. Absolutely nothing, because most of the money that was allocated to TARP has not even been spent. Most of that money, nobody knows where it is. Nobody knows what happened. You know where it's going.
Much of it was used to recapitalize.
Yes, and there was not a crash like we were led to believe. So that's my main point.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, if you believe that these institutions that were propped up by this money, and I mean, there's another bailout that most people don't really talk about, which is from the Federal Reserve. I mean, trillions of dollars were spent on top of this congressional money. But, I mean, if you believe that the economy are these few actors, then yeah, I mean, you feel like, well, the economy is just going to implode. But I think if you think the economy is made up of more than just those few firms, there's really, I mean, hardly an argument to prop them up.
I think what Bob's referring to, there's the $16.1 trillion that these banks got through the Federal Reserve, which is outside of the Troubled Asset Relief Program that was voted on by Congress. They basically just went to the Fed behind closed doors and got this money in secret. And this is at a time when the gross domestic product of the United States as a whole is $14.5 trillion. So $1.5 trillion in excess of that is the amount that they're secretly handing out to these big banks without us even knowing about it. And this is at a time when we've got 46 million people living below the poverty line in this country.
Was this unconstitutional?
Yes.
Does it fit under the proper and necessary clause to protect the general welfare? No?
No.
Lisa?
I don't think there was really any evidence that we actually needed TARP. They didn't provide us with any evidence. They just basically said it and did it.
And I think the thing that's the most important on this issue with regards to Tea Party versus Occupy, I think that we are on the same page on this. I absolutely agree with everything that you said. You're 100% right. The problem is that and I think this is a purposeful thing by the government, is that they have refocused what the real issue is. The evil that caused this is not capitalism. Capitalism doesn't do this. The Constitution didn't do this. The Constitution and capitalism
Who's saying
would
the capitalism
not have
and the
allowed
Constitution
this.
did do this?
They did not do this. And let me tell you why.
Who's saying that they did?
Well, let me tell you
I
why.
haven't heard anyone say that.
Because part of what the discussion has been is that, you know, the bailouts gave capitalism a bad name. That, you know, capitalism is all for the bankers, and just to give money to the bankers and give money to the 1% and the rich. And that's not the case. Capitalism would have allowed those companies to fail, and that's what should have happened. But I promise real quick. The other thing is that, you know, the reason that this happened is not because of capitalism, but because of the government. The government is the one that did this. The government, first of all, as Bob said, this was a swindle, and I couldn't agree more. But the swindle was set up by the government. The federal government did this. First with the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which I know we agree on. I know that's one of your that's what allowed the banks to merge together to become these big conglomerates. And then they did the Community Reinvestment Act to pass out mortgages to everybody without really any kind of guidelines.
Are you both in agreement on the Community Reinvestment Act? That it was government run amok, sticking its nose in business it shouldn't be?
Go ahead,
I don't necessarily feel that getting people in stable housing is outside the realm of the government function. I think when there's a need for something like that, it's within government power to work in ways to fulfill that. However, I don't think home ownership in the subprime mortgages, adjustable rate mortgages, things like that have high default rates are necessarily should be part of stable housing. I think you can solve that without.
Do you agree that the government encouraged that behavior?
I think with that act it did, yes.
Certainly they did, because the banks are not altruistic, as we all agree. They would have, if they could have made money doing it, they would have done it. And so they didn't do it because they knew there was a high default rate. And then, with this whole situation that was set up with Goldman Sachs and AIG, that was all the government, 100% the government. Now, Goldman Sachs and AIG all had their hands out, that's for sure. But they couldn't have done it if the government hadn't been complicit.
Let's take a second to check in to see what Sarah has to say. She's following what people are saying about this on social media.
Thanks, Mark. We've got a lot of people saying that because both sides agree on TARP, it's time to move on to another topic. We've got a comment on Sarah's glasses, so they're a big hit. Also, people are saying that they hope that both sides find that they have more in common with each other than they had previously thought. One thing that continues to come up that kind of goes along with TARP is the national debt and the crisis that we have there. People are wanting to know what both sides think are some solutions to addressing that problem.
Okay, what of it? Rick, you want to start?
Before we move on to that, one thing with regards, again, to the whole TARP issue, we all agree that to provide $700 billion plus of our money to the very actors who created this nightmare is completely wrong. The area of disagreement is that the institution that did this, was it the banks that did this? No, they didn't write the checks themselves. It was government. And so we have this incident occur, TARP, the entire bailout of the bankers that caused these problems. And then the question is, how do we respond to it? And I think one of the biggest differences between Occupy and Tea Party is that as we look at it, we see that the institution that embezzled our money from us and gave it to these criminal bankers should have less power, less trust.
Rick,
we should put less authority in them.
How many fraudulent loans did the government write?
Pardon me?
How many fraudulent loans did the government write?
The federal government, in terms of the actual loans themselves.
The fraudulent loans, the robo-signing, the indiscriminate gambling of other people's money, that was not the doing of the government. That was big business. The government neglected to do its job in restricting their behaviors, but at the end of the day, the businesses and the banks and the brokerage firms are the ones who actually did what they did. All the federal government did was fail to stop it.
No, there's a corollary to that. If we go all the way back, if you think, who's at the end of this? I mean, when the music stops playing, somebody's not going to have a chair. Who is it? Somebody goes out and gives a loan to a person who has no business getting a loan. Maybe there's robo-signatures, what have you. They then give it to the bank, who then sends it to Wall Street, who packages it up and securitizes it and sells it off. Who buys it? Fishing villages in Norway, corporations, retirement, pension plans. Why do they buy it? Because it's got a AAA rating. Really? You mean all these deadbeats who are living in homes who are never going to pay, that has a AAA rating? You bet. Why? Because it's backed by two GSEs, two government entity corporations, Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, because they knew at the end of the day that when this thing blows, and it was going to blow, they're going to get every single penny of their money back because it's going to be paid by taxpayers.
And I think we get your point on that, Rick. Before we leave this topic, you used very interesting language. You called these executives at Goldman Sachs and AIG and the like criminal bankers. Did the executives who overinvested in these mortgage-backed securities get off too easy?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, at least during the savings and loan crisis, people went to jail. I mean, so far as I know, no one's been prosecuted except for Bernie Madoff. That's just because, he ripped off rich people. But
you could not invest with Bernie Madoff unless you were a certified investor. And what that means is you have to have at least $1 million to invest. Ordinary people could not invest in Bernie Madoff, but when ordinary people got ripped off, they could not get their money back.
So what should have happened? Right?
Bernie Madoff
what should have happened to these CEOs, to Dick Fuld and the rest?
Throw them in jail? I mean, I don't care what happens to them. I just don't want them running my economy.
Tea Party, do you agree?
The people who gave them the money, the people who allowed that to happen, they need to go to prison. They should have just let the bankers fail. They should have let them fail. One thing I thought you might not know, this is kind of interesting.
They're the same people.
Little factoid is
the
that
board of the Federal Reserve is the same as the boards of those banks that
unfortunately,
they're bailing out.
almost most of the Treasury comes from Goldman Sachs. Unfortunately, so you're right about that. But to answer one of the questions that you raised earlier, is who in the government wrote mortgages? One of the things that I found really interesting in researching this is that prior to the Community Modernization Act, or the Community Reinvestment Act, where they wanted to promote mortgages, there was this pattern of behavior that was called redlining. So the banks would take these districts and they would redline them and say, you can't loan there because these people are too risky. And you know who was involved in that, or who set up this redline system? FHA. It wasn't the private banks, but it was FHA that did that. And so, there was quite a bit of government that did it.
What you're probably going to hear a lot tonight is the fact that, one side maybe blames big business and the other side maybe blames big government. But I think what happens when they're the same? What happens when we're dealing with a revolving door that employs the same people?
That's exactly what we have to do, is take the power away from them. Because big business, you're right, if they're given the opportunity, because as I said before, they're not altruistic. They want to make money. And given the opportunity, they will do it in any way they can. You take the power away from them by letting the government cannot do anything for them. They have to operate on their own.
Though, to try to discern motive here? I mean, I'm sorry, if I am running a company, yes, my main job is to provide a service, but in order to provide a service to people, that business has to stay profitable. Do you really think that any of these executives were out to ruin people's lives?
And that's why it's the job of the government to regulate these industries, because we know what the banks are going to do. They're going to make as much money as they possibly can in any way that they possibly can and get away with it. They're going to do it as far as they can go within the law, and they're going to go a little bit farther and pay some fines. But whatever the government allows them to do to make money, they're going to do. And that's why the responsibility rests with the government, not with business, to rein in what they're doing and regulate financial markets and make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Did the Obama administration's new financial reform regulations go far enough, in your opinion?
No,
they won't be effective.
You mean Frank Dodd?
Yeah.
Right, Dodd-Frank, right.
Okay.
Well, let's hear from the Tea Party on this. Is regulation a problem in this area? Was it lax regulation that helped lead to the financial crisis?
That's part of it. Incentives drive behavior. And in this case, something we haven't discussed is moral hazard. They knew they'd get bailed out. They knew that money was going to come. So year after year, they were able to report these huge bonuses and give them to themselves, knowing that as they built up this house of cards, when it finally ruptured, they were going to make private the profits and make public the debt. They were going to shift that to the taxpayer. So as far as how best to handle this, again, Freddie Mae and Fannie Mae have been a catastrophe. I mean, when you look at it in the context of causing this. So the answer is, instead of more government, less government. As far as the regulations go, the two things that everybody demanded from this was, one, end too big to fail. Bust these big banking cartels in New York City that are controlling our entire country, bust them up. They have 10 times more power than all of the other corporations combined. Because if you look at who owns the media, they get that financing from those big banks. So they have that incredible microphone. Bust those monster banks up. That's number one. Number two is, if you're going to go wild and do all these derivative things and these highly leveraged, risky type of things.
That most people can't understand, by the way, who aren't in that business.
Right. Do not also do that with FDIC-backed money. Do not sit there and run these hedge funds and private equity and these highly leveraged entities. Make sure that if a bank is a commercial bank, they're a commercial bank, and if they're a Wall Street brokerage firm, they're a Wall Street brokerage firm.
Right. Well, did it bother anybody that the Treasury Secretary who was orchestrating all of this, Hank Paulson, was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs right before he took the job?
Exactly. And
It's not even close to unique.
I think that's what you're getting into here is it's being framed as if, like Bob said, that there's two different entities to bail, but like you just stated, it's the same one. They're encouraging these practices or allowing these practices. The very same people who are supposed to be the watchdogs here are they're making money off of it, encouraging these practices, and if we continue to frame the argument as whether or not we should be blaming corporations or capitalism or the government, we're still not really focusing on solutions and holding people accountable. So I think once the conversation can get to a more unified thing is that we need to have more regulation of banks so that they can't pull this stuff off, and we need to hold the bankers who put us in the position accountable. That would...
Which means what?
Yeah, well, it goes to Rick's point. We want to bust all these trusts, right? I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was the big trust buster. He was in government. I mean, who's going to bust these big institutions? And that's the problem we're dealing with. And I think it's up to the people to finally rise up and take these institutions down, or at least...
I think we can start by writing them $2.5 trillion checks.
Right.
Sure.
And then that's part of the problem. The government has overstepped its bounds.
Sure.
And even to force a bank to loan money out to somebody who has no way to be able to pay it back, forced to do so by the government, that's overstepping their regulations. We need less government, not more government.
Right.
We need less regulation, not more regulation.
Well, the reason to...
We've got to move off of this topic. One more comment. Then we'll move
The
on
only
to our next
reason
one.
to focus it all on who's to blame is so that we can prevent it from happening again. And it was the attempt to regulate that brought this about, because the Commodity Modernization Act, which was sponsored by Senator Lugar of our state, that's what allowed these banks to get involved in what's called credit default swaps. And so they got paid again after they bought insurance on these loans that they knew would fail.
Essentially
they knew they
betting
would,
against.
so they bet against
Right.
them, and then they got paid again. That's why AIG got bailed out, because they were the ones that offered these credit default swaps to the banks. And if they hadn't gotten bailed out, then Goldman would have never got their, insurance money, if that's what you want to
The
call
real
it.
reason AIG got bailed out is because they paid their insurance. They paid the politicians before they took office, so they
Yes.
they know who the boss is.
Well, they also hold the federal pensions, too.
And I
So
think
they didn't
we'll-
want them to fail.
Well, we may delve into this territory later on in the broadcast. So let's end this issue right there and move on to another one. This is going to be an interesting one. Balancing safety and freedom. And here's what I want to start with. The National Defense Authorization Act, which was just signed by President Obama. It allows it could be construed by some people as allowing the indefinite detention of even U.S. citizens who are suspected of being belligerent without trial. Let me throw this out there. Is this a slippery slope toward tyranny, as some have suggested?
That's something that Occupy has kind of kept an eye on as well. Here in Fort Wayne, we've done 2 rallies We've tried to make those educational, stopping people and explaining to them what's going on, because what's interesting is that most people have no idea what we're talking about. The 2 rallies that we held were some of the only times local media had ever covered the NDAA or the signing of it, despite the provision in there that, in my opinion, does allow for the indefinite detentions of U.S. citizens without trial, without charge, and in
the fact that it's even a matter of opinion is cause for concern.
Right.
Yeah, well, I've read the section of the legislation. And of course I'm no legal expert, but I can see how it would be construed that way. I'm interested to hear from the Tea Party movement on this as well.
I think this should be the one area where we should have complete agreement. When it comes to issues of finance and size and scope of government, obviously there's going to be areas we're not going to agree on. But what we're seeing right now is a radicalized move to a high-tech, high-surveillance, militarized police state. We have these fusion centers coming into all these different communities. Almost all of our major cities now are getting rings of surveillance cameras that will be capable of doing face recognition, real-time monitoring, tracking. The moment we start.
By the way, I have not fact-checked that particular item, so we're trusting you on it.
I sent it to you. Well, actually, there was a great disinformation article by the Associated Press that was in in the various newspapers, and in it they said, it's wonderful, Indianapolis is going to get all of these surveillance cameras for the Super Bowl. And then about 8 or 9 paragraphs down, I finally said, well, actually it isn't because of the Super Bowl. They're not going to be taken out when the Super Bowl is over. In fact, they're going to continue to install almost all of Manhattan, almost all of downtown London is under constant surveillance.
So you think we're becoming a police state? You think the United States is becoming a police state?
We're putting in the apparatuses of a police state. We're certainly not a police state right now. There's lots of freedoms and liberties. What they're doing is they're putting in the apparatuses. The FAA just approved to have a wide expansion in the number of drones. They're projecting 30,000 drones flying around, covering American airspace in just 8 years by 2020. Is this what the American people want? In London, the feeling of the police state is everywhere, and increasingly it's coming here. The question is, where was the discussion? When did we have the conversation? Do we want these sort of changes or not? I don't remember it ever having occurred. They just suddenly show up. There's your cameras,
right,
and here's your new surveillance, and isn't it a wonderful thing? Homeland Security said you need it.
Yeah, by executive fiat, these things come down. Bob, what do you think? Is this a step toward tyranny?
I think it's a major one. I think it's, see, I'm a history major, I went to IPFW, graduated here. And so I see a continuation of policy rather than something out of the blue. I think the military-industrial complex has added a bit more capitalist flavor to it, but I think it's in government's interest to stay in power.
Are you worried, though? Are you one of those people who's worried that we're on the way toward government watching us in some form or fashion, keeping tabs on us all the time?
I think anyone who's not worried about that's naive.
Anybody who's not worried about that is what?
Naive.
Naive, really?
Yeah.
Explain.
We're seeing more and more of our freedoms being eroded through the surveillance, through the TSA, through all types of government intervention. And a lot of our local governments and state governments, they're not being asked, about these things taking place. They're being forced to do it. They're being brought into all of this at the behest of the federal government. We are seeing more and more of the executive orders, the laws that are coming down and going through Congress to just tell us that we're going to be losing more and more of our freedoms. People aren't looking into this because they're too busy doing other things, and we're trying to make them aware of what's coming down the pipe, because it eventually is going to affect every one of us, not only the ones that are in this room, but the American public.
Max,
and before you know it, your liberties are going to be flipped right out of your hand.
Max, I know you wanted to say something. You spoke up.
I just think anybody who thinks it's still a matter of question whether or not this government's intruding on the lives of citizens just isn't paying attention. I mean, there were just these 2 attempts at passing laws to censor the internet, SOPA and the IP Protect Act. Both of them failed, and then they just went ahead and started enforcing them anyway. They're privatizing, commoditizing information in every form, and anything that's not under the control of a big corporation is contraband. So that's why all of a sudden, if you get on YouTube once in a while, now you try to watch a video, and sometimes the video's been yanked by somebody who claims to own a copyright, and that happens preemptively. without any due process, and it's in the hands of the private corporations, not any enforcement agency of the government at all. And our information is being privatized, our security is being privatized. We've been hearing a lot about Stratfor the last few days, and they're basically a privatized security service that's doing the work of the CIA. They're doing covert intelligence on behalf of the government, on behalf of the military, but they're a private organization that has no accountability to the American people.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to hop in. I agree with Max. I think we've had an increasing amount of private firms stepping in to where it was a public entity, where it was in the public interest to have a national defense. But now all of a sudden, I mean, mercenaries are nothing new, but I think the rate in which we are basically funding private firms with a blank check is just
You're
bankrupting
against
them.
it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me ask you about the Patriot Act. We're going to get to Sarah for some of your comments in just a second. Who thought the continual reauthorization of the Patriot Act was a good idea? Anybody here? No Tea Party? No? Okay. All right, now this is interesting. Let's hold that thought.